We talk about something today a lot of people might not give a lot of thought to, and it's going to be about the history of our brothers and sisters since the death of Yeshua and up to now. Title is going to be Sabbath Observance Throughout the Century. We talk about the institution of the Sabbath. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day Elohim ended his work which he made, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work which he had made. And Elohim blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he had rested from the work which Elohim created and made. Genesis 2, 1 through 3. And Yeshua came to Nazareth, where he'd been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the seventh day and stood up to read. And that's found in Luke 4:16. And behold, one came up to him and said, Good master, what good thing shall I do that I may have eternal life? And he said unto him, If thou wilt enter in life, keep the commandments. But pray ye, this is a different part, but pray ye that your flight not be in winter, neither on the Sabbath day. Note that Yeshua asked his disciples to pray that in the flight from the doomed city of Jerusalem, they would not have to flee on the Sabbath day. Well, this flight took place in 70 A.D., 40 years after his crucifixion. And we see here that Yeshua fully expected his congregation to be observing his true Sabbath day that he himself proclaimed to be the sovereign of. And Paul, as his matter was, went into him, and 3 Sabbath days reasoned with him out of Scriptures. Did Messiah fail to inform Paul on the road to Damascus that there is now a new Sabbath? Or rather, does the Sabbath of Yeshua speak volumes against the papal Sabbath? And when the Jews were gone out from the synagogue, the Gentiles besought that these words might be preached to them on the next Sabbath. And the next Sabbath came almost the whole city together to hear the word of Elohim. Where do we find Gentiles in the Gentile day gathering on the Sabbath? It was not a synagogue meeting in verse 44, for it says the whole city came together. Verse 42 said they asked to hear the message on the next Sabbath. And we're talking about Acts chapter 13. And get this, the Bible doesn't say that the old Jewish Sabbath was passed away, but the Spirit Elohim, writing the books of Acts some 30 years after the crucifixion, called it the next Sabbath. And I was in the Spirit on the Sabbath. Clearly shows the Sabbath to be Yah's day. And we go through. We're going to start from the centuries. We talked about the first century where the Sabbath was proclaimed. Now, the early Christians in the second century, the primitive Christians still had a great veneration for the Sabbath, and they spent the day in devotion and sermons. And it was not to be doubled that they derived this practice from it's not to be doubted that they derived this practice from the apostles themselves, as it appears in several scriptures to this purpose. And the Sabbath was a strong tie which united them with the life of the whole people. And in keeping the Sabbath holy, they followed not only the examples, but also the command of Yeshua. And that's written in the Geschichte, the Sonntags, or the history of the Sundays. And the early Christians in the second century, the Gentile Christians observed also the Sabbaths. And that's in Geisler's church history. The primitives Christians did keep the Sabbath of the Jews. Therefore, the Christians for a long time together did keep their conventions upon the Sabbath, in which some portions of the law were read and continued to the Laodicean Council. And of course, that can be found in the Whole Works of Jeremy Taylor, volume 9, page 416. It is certain that the ancient Sabbath did remain and was observed by the Christians of the East Church for about 300 years after our Savior's death. From the Apostles' time to the Council of Laodicea was about the year 364. The holy observance of, they call it the Jews' Sabbath, but it's Yahweh's Sabbath. It continued, as may be proved by many authors, notwithstanding, of course, the decree of the council against it. In the 3rd century, the Sabbath was observed in Egypt. Except ye make the Sabbath a real Sabbath, ye shall not see the Father. Thus shall observe the Sabbath on account of him who has ceased his work of creation, but ceased not from his work of providence. It is a rest of meditation of the law, not for the idleness of hands. And that is by the ante-Nicene Fathers, from the Constitutions of the Holy Apostles, which is a document of the 3rd and 4th centuries. It was also observed in Alexandria, Oregon, after the festival of the unceasing sacrifice, which is the crucifixion, is put the second festival of the Sabbath, and is fitting for whoever is righteous among the set-apart ones to keep also the festival of the Sabbath. There remains therefore a Sabbathmas, that is the keeping of the Sabbath to the people of Elohim. And that's referring to Hebrews chapter 4, verse 9. Even in the ancient land of Israel, all the way to India, which is also part of the Church of the East, as early as AD 225, there existed large biospheres or conferences of the Church of the East, stretching from Palestine to India. And it's talking about the early spread of Christianity. Even in India, the Kushan dynasty of North India called a famous council of Buddhist priests at Vasalia to bring uniformity among the Buddhist monks on the observance of their weekly Sabbath. Some have been so impressed by the writings of the Old Testament that they begin to keep the Sabbath. And that's referred to the Creed of Half Japan. The seventh-day Sabbath was solemnized by Yeshua, the apostles, and primitive Christians until the Laodicean Council did in a manner quite abolished observations of it. If we go to the 4th century, we see that it was still observed in Italy and the East. It was the practice generally of the Eastern churches and some of the churches of the West. For in the Church of Milan, it seems that Saturday was held in high esteem. Not that the Eastern churches or in the rest of the world observed that they were inclined to Judaism, but they came together on the Sabbath day to worship Yeshua, Messiah, who is the sovereign of the Sabbath. And that's the history of the Sabbath in the Orient and most of the world. The ancient Christians were very careful on the observance of Saturday or the seventh day. It is plain that all the Oriental churches in the greatest part of the world observed the Sabbath as a festival. Athanasius likewise told us that they held religious assemblies on the Sabbath, not because they were, quote, infected with Judaism, but because they wanted to worship Yeshua, who is the sovereign of the Sabbath. In Abyssinia, in the last half of that century, St. Ambrose of Milan stated officially that the Abyssinian bishop Eusebius had traveled almost everywhere in the country of the Ceres, which is China. For more than 17 centuries, the Abyssinian church continued to sanctify Sabbath as the holy day of the fourth commandment. In Arabia, Persia, India, in China, of all places. Magana proves that in this 370 AD, Abyssinian Christianity, which was a Sabbath-keeping congregation, was so popular that its famous director, Musaicus, traveled extensively to the east promoting the Sabbath, promoting the church in Arabia, Persia, India, and China. And that's found in Truth Triumphant. It was also, the Sabbath was observed in Spain, Vira. The canon of the 26 Counts of Vira reveals that the Church of Spain at that time kept the seventh day. And they also had a resolution as to the fasting every Sabbath that resolved that this era be corrected of fasting every Sabbath. This resolution of the council is in direct opposition to the policy that the Church of Rome had inaugurated, in that commanding that the Sabbath was a fast day in order to humiliate it and to make it repugnant to the people. As a point of further interest, that to note in northeastern Spain, near the city of Barcelona, is a city called Sabadell, in the district originally inhabited by a people called the Valdenses and the Sabbatati. Now they were in Persia 40 years of persecution under Shapur II. The popular complaint against the Christians is they despise our sun god. They have divine services on Saturday. They desecrate the earth by burying their dead in it. And that's found in Truth Triumphant. Of course they despise the sun god. They worship the only true Elohim. As the sign is, they kept the Sabbath. And they had the Council of Laodicea in AD 365, and on Canon 16 on Saturday, the Gospels and other portions of the Scriptures shall be read aloud. Canon 29, Christians shall not Judaize and be idle on Saturday, but shall work on that day. But the Lord's day they shall especially honor, as being Christians shall, if possible, do no work on that day. And they talking about the Lord's day is going to be on Sunday. They had made a direct injunction against following the commandments. But we'll see, going through the observance, we come to the 5th century, and there's people still keeping the Sabbath. For although almost all churches throughout the world celebrate a sacred mystery on the Sabbath every week, yet the Christians of Alexandria and Rome, on account of some ancient traditions, refuse to do this. The footnote which accompanies the foregoing quotation explains the use of the word Sabbath. It says that upon Saturday it should be observed, and that Sunday is never called a Sabbath by the ancient fathers and historians. And that's found in the Ecclesiastical History, Book 5 and Chapter 22. In Constantinople, now known as Istanbul, the people of Constantinople and almost everywhere assemble together on the Sabbath. And it goes on some as well as on the first day of the week, which custom is never observed at Rome or at Alexandria. And the world Augustine, the bishop of Hippo, North Africa, Augustine shows that the Sabbath was observed in his day in the greater part of the Christian world. And his testimony in this respect is all more valuable because he himself was an earnest and consistent Sunday keeper. He's still pointing out. And here's another one. Talking about Pope Innocent. Pope Sylvester from 314 to 335 was the first to order the churches to fast on Saturday, and Pope Innocent made it a binding laws in the churches that obeyed him in order to bring the Sabbath into disfavorable. Ignatius did ordain the Sabbath or Saturday to be always fasted, and it talks about and that's found in the history of the Sabbath. Down through the 5th century AD, down even to the 5th century, the observance of the Sabbath was continued by the Christian congregation, and that's documented in ancient Christianity exemplified. The devoutest Christians did ordinary work on Sunday, and that's in the treatise of the Sabbath day. Even in France at that time, the Sabbath was observed. Augustine deplored the fact that in 2 neighboring churches in Africa, one observed the 7th-day Sabbath and the other fasted on it. That's also found in the history of the Sabbath. In Spain, Ambrose sanctified the 7th day as the Sabbath, and Ambrose had a great influence in Spain, which was also observing the Saturday Sabbath. What other Sabbath is there but the 7th day? Sidonius is the fact that it was formerly the custom of the East to keep the Sabbath in the same manner as the Lord's Day and to hold sacred assemblies on, while on the other hand, the people of the West contending for the Lord's Day, they have neglected the celebration of the Sabbath. And it's still going on talking about the Church of the East observing the Sabbath. And there were several cities and villages in Egypt, contrary to the uses established elsewhere, the people met together on Sabbath evenings, and though they had dined previously, partake of the mysteries. We go to the 6th century AD, the Scottish Church. And this latter instance seemed to have followed the custom of which we find traces in the early monastic church of Ireland, by which they held Saturday to be the Sabbath on which they rested from their labors. We seem to see here an allusion to the custom observed by the early monastic church of Ireland of keeping the day of rest on Saturday or the Sabbath. And that is found in history of the Catholic Church in Scotland. And Scotland, Columba, having observed on his labors in Scotland for 34 years, he clearly and openly foretold of his death, and on Saturday, the month of June, said to his disciples, "Diarmid, this day is called the Sabbath, that is, a rest day, and such it will be truly to me, for it will put an end to my labors." The editor of the biggest biography of Columba says in a footnote, "Our Saturday, the custom to call the Lord's Day Sabbath, did not commence until 1,000 years later." It's talking about the life of Columba. Even in the 7th century, the churches in Scotland and Ireland, they say it's been customary in the Celtic churches of early time in Ireland as well as Scotland to keep Saturday as a day of rest from labor. They obeyed the 4th commandment literally upon the 7th day of the week. And that's documented in the Church of Scotland. The Celts used the Latin Bible, unlike the Vulgate, and kept Saturday as a day of rest with, of course, they mixed in a little bit of religious services on Sunday and talk about the rise of the medieval church. Gregory wrote against Roman citizens who forbid any work being done on the Sabbath day. And that's mentioned in Nicene and Post-Nicene Fathers, 2nd series. And Going on, Gregory, he still made his pronouncement. Gregory, bishop, by the grace of God, to his well-beloved sons, the Roman citizens, it has come to me that certain men, a perverse spirit has disseminated upon you things depraved and opposed to the holy faith, so that they forbid anything to be done on the day of the Sabbath. What shall I call them except preachers of Antichrist? And he's calling those who keep the fourth commandment, he's calling them Antichrist. And this is where the persecution really begins. And of course, we know that another religion was also formed in the 7th century. Pope Gregory also declared that when Antichrist shall come, he shall keep Saturday as a Sabbath. And that's found in the epistles of Gregory. Moreover, the same Pope had issued an official pronouncement against the section of city Rome itself, because the believers there rested and worshipped on the Sabbath. We even go down to the Sabbath through the centuries, and we're talking about in the 8th century. And there was the Council of Friuli, Italy, in AD 791, Canon 13. We command all Christians to observe the Lord's Day to be held, not in honor of the past Sabbath, but on account that the holy night of the first week be called the Lord's Day. When speaking of the Sabbath, which the Jews observe the last day of the week, which are also our peasants observe. In Persia and Mesopotamia, the hills of Persia and the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates re-echoed their songs of praise. They reaped their harvests and paid their tithes. They repaired to their churches on the Sabbath day for the worship of Elohim. And that's found in the Real Encyclopedia for Protestants and Kirch, which is the encyclopedia for the Protestants and the Church. India, China, and Persia, and all in the East, widespread and enduring was the observance of the seventh-day Sabbath among the believers of the Church of the East and the St. Thomas Christians of Indians, who were never connected with Rome. It is also maintained among those bodies which broke off from Rome after the Council of the Chalcedon, namely the Abyssinians, the Jacobites, the Maronites, and the Armenians. And that's found in the New Encyclopedia of Religious Knowledge. The Council of Lithuania, Belgium, AD 745. The third allocution of this council warns against the observance of the Sabbath, referring to the decree of the Council of Laodicea. And they are making pronouncements still against the Sabbath, even though it was widespread. In AD 781, the famous China monument was inscribed in marble to tell of the growth of Christianity in China at that time. Inscriptions consisting of 763 words was unearthed in 1625 near the city of Chang'an and now stands in the forest of tablets. The following extract from the stone shows that the Sabbath was observed. On the seventh day we offer sacrifice, having purified our hearts and receive absolution for our sins. This religion, so perfect and so excellent, is difficult to name, but it enlightens darkness by its brilliant precepts. That's found in a book called Christianity in China. In the 9th century A.D., Bulgaria, in the early seasons of its evangelizations, has been taught that no work shall be performed on the Sabbath. And of course, Pope Nicholas I had answered a letter from Bulgaris, the ruling prince of Bulgaria. And he said that bathing is allowed on Sunday, but one is to cease from work on Sunday, but not also on the Sabbath. Because the Bulgarians had been accustomed to rest on the Sabbath. And of course, Pope Nicholas wrote against this practice. And it's even documented. Photius, Patriarch of Constantinople, against the canons, they introduced the Bulgarians to fast on the Sabbath. The papacy always tried to bring the seventh-day Sabbath into disrepute by insisting that all should fast on this day. And this matter, the Catholic Church sought to turn people towards Sunday, the first day of the week that Rome had adopted. Nowhere in Scriptures does it say that we shall observe Sunday instead of the seventh day. And in the Athenians, Cardinal Hagenrofer says that they stood in intimate relations with Emperor Michael II, testifies that they observed the Sabbath, and that's written in the Kirchengeschichte, or History of the Church. India, Abyssinian, widespread was enduring the observance of the seventh-day Sabbath among the believers of the Church of the East and the St. Thomas Christians of India. It was also maintained by the Abyssinians. And in of course, in Bulgaria, the persecution began because Pope Nicholas also sent the Prince of Bulgaria a long document says that one is to cease work on Sunday, but not on the Sabbath. The head of the Greek Church, offended at this interference of the papacy, declared the Pope excommunicated. And that's found in Truth Triumphant. In the 10th century A.D., Scotland, they worked on Sunday but kept the Saturday in the sabbatical manner. And that's written in the History of Scotland from the Roman occupation. Even in the Church of the East in Kurdistan, the Nestorians ate no pork, kept the Sabbath, and they believe in neither auricular confection or purgatory. And that's found in the New Encyclopedia of Religious Knowledge. The Waldensians, because they observed no other day of rest but the Sabbath day, they called them in Sabbathus, as much as to say they observed no Sabbath. And that's Luther's forerunners. The Waldenese. Roman Catholic writers tried to evade the apostolic origin of the Waldenese as to make it appear that the Roman is the only apostolic church, and all the others are later novelties. And for this reason, they tried to make out the Waldenses originated with Peter Waldo of the 12th century. You know, I look and I go in a bookstore sometimes and I see these little games. It's called Where's Waldo?
Find Waldo.
Yeah, Find Waldo. Wonder where this comes from. I imagine at one time there was some hunting going on. I mean, millions of people kept the Sabbath at one time. Many of them have been destroyed. Well, of course, we know what their eternal salvation is all about, and that's the important thing. And the Waldenses, they say it's not true that Waldo gave his name to the inhabitants of the cities. They were called Waldenese or Valds before his times, from the valleys in which they dwelt. But you know, Waldo he learned about the Sabbath and he taught about it. Because he was called Valdus or Waldo because he received his religious notions from the inhabitants of the valley. And that's also in the history of the Christian church. Even in the 11th century AD, in Scotland, they held that Saturday was properly the Sabbath, in which they abstained from work. They worked on Sunday, but they kept Saturday in the sabbatical matter. Of course, Queen Margaret had a say about this. She abolished it. It was another custom of theirs to neglect the reverence due to the Elohim's day by devoting himself to every kind of worldly business upon it, just as they did upon other days. That was contrary to the law Queen Margaret, proved to him as well by reason as by authority. Let us venerate the Elohim's day, she said, because the resurrection of our Elohim, which happened on that day, and let us no longer do servile works upon it, bearing in mind that upon this day we were redeemed from the slavery of the devil. The blessed Pope Gregory affirms the same, and they talk about the life of Saint Margaret. And they also, Pope Urban II decreed at the Council of Clement in 1095 that the Sabbath be set aside in the honor of Virgin Mary. In Constantinople it says, because you observe the Sabbath with the Jews and the Elohim's day with us, you seem to imitate that such observance of the sect of the Nazarenes. And the observance of Saturday, as everyone knows, is the subject of bitter dispute against the Greeks and the Latins, talking about the history of the Eastern Church. Yes, there was a rift, all right. As we go through the observance through the century, we're in the 12th AD, and here's where it starts getting interested. In Lombardy, traces of Sabbath keepers are found in the times of Gregory I, Gregory VII, and in the 12th century in Lombardy. Robinson gives an account of some of the Valdenese of the Alps who were called Sabbatati, and more frequently Insabbatate. One says they were so named from the Hebrew word Sabbath because they kept the Sabbath day for Yahweh's day. And that's found in the general history of the Baptist denomination. I know this sounds a little long and all, but we're taught that this is a whole new revelation, that the Church of God, founded by Herbert W., was the resurgence, was the rediscovery of the Sabbath. Yeah, they're part of the true congregation. They aren't the true congregation. We aren't the true congregation. We're a part of it. There's been people ever since the beginning of Yeshua who has kept the Sabbath day. It might have been down to maybe 100 families at times, but there's always been this faithful. In Hungary, France, England, Italy, Germany, the spread of heresy at this time was almost incredible. From Bulgaria to Hebrew, from northern France to Tiber, everywhere we meet them, whole countries are infested, like Hungary and southern France. They abound in many other countries, in Germany, in Italy, in the Netherlands, and even England. They put forward their efforts. And this is found in the Geschichte der Ketzer, or History of the Heretics. They hate the Sabbath keepers. And then among the documents, we have the same people, an explanation of 10 commandments dated by Boyer in 1120, observance of the Sabbath day by ceasing from worldly labors is enjoined. And they talk about, this is written in the history of the Valdenese. This is where they really started persecuting more In Wales, there's much evidence that the Sabbath prevailed at Wales University until AD 1115, when the first Roman bishop was seated at St. David's. The old Welsh Sabbath-keeping churches did not even altogether bow the knee to Rome, but fled to their hiding places. And that's found in Lewis, Seventh-day Baptists in Europe and America. In France, for 20 years, Peter de Broye stirred southern France. He especially emphasized the day of worship that was recognized at that time among the Celtic churches of the British Isles, for among the Paulicians and the great church of the East, namely the seventh day of the fourth commandment. The Pasagini, or the papal author Bonacursus, wrote the following against the Pasagini. Not a few, but many know that there are errors of those who are called the Pasagini. First, they teach that we should obey the Sabbath. Furthermore, to increase their error, they condemn and reject all the church fathers and the whole Roman Church. I say to them, good job.
Right.
There are times when we're supposed to be disobedient. And in the 13th century, they say that the blessed Pope Sylvester was the Antichrist, of whom mention is made in the epistles of St. Paul, having been the son of perdition. They also say that the keeping of the Sabbath ought to take place. And this is in the ecclesiastical history of the ancient Church of Piedmont. And that's by a prominent Roman Catholic author writing about the Waldenses. In France, to destroy completely these heretics, and they're calling the people who kept the Sabbath, Pope Innocent III sent Dominican inquisitors into France and also crusaders, promising a plenary remission of all sins to those who took on the crusades against the Albigenses. And this is in Catholic Encyclopedia. The Valdenese of France. The inquisitors declared that the sign of Avaldos, deemed worthy of death, was he that followed Yeshua and sought to obey the commandments of Elohim. And that's in the history of the Inquisition of the Middle Ages. In France, thousands of Yah's people were tortured to death by the Inquisition, buried alive, burned to death, hacked to pieces by the Crusaders. While devastating the city of Patera, the soldiers asked the Catholic leaders how should they know who were heretics. And they said, well, slay them all, for the LORD knows who is his. And they made a canon against the Sabbath keepers in 1229, Canon 3. The LORDs of the lords of the different districts shall have the villas, houses, and woods diligently searched, and the hiding places of the heretics destroyed. Lay members are not allowed to possess the books of either the Old or New Testaments. The Paulicians, Petrobiznians, the Pasaginians, the Valdenese, and Sabati were great Sabbath-keeping bodies of Europe all the way down to 1250 AD. And one thing, the Mongolian conquests, when they came through, they did not injure the Church of the East, the Sabbath-keeping people. On the contrary, a number of the Mongolian princesses and a large number of the Mongolian queens were members of the church. We hear about the Mongolian hordes. Well, in this case, they helped protect some of our ancestors, the ones who were obedient to the faith. The Valdenese said that we ought to worship only one Elohim who is able to help us, and not the saints that departed, for we ought to keep holy the Sabbath day. And that's written in Luther's Forerunners. For centuries, the evangelical bodies, especially the Valdenese, were called insabbates because of the Sabbath keeping. In 1310, 200 years before Luther, the Bohemian Brethren constitute 1/4 of the population of Bohemia, and they were in touch with the Waldenese who abounded in Austria, Lombardy, Bohemia, North Germany, Thuringia, Brandenburg, Moravia. Erasmus pointed out how strictly Bohemian Waldenese kept the Sabbath day Sabbath. And that's written in Armitage, The History of the Baptists. And then, too, the Catechism was used in the 4th century. The Sabbath commandment read thus: "Thou shalt not forget to keep the 7th day." This is quoted in documents and studies concerning the history of the Lutheran Catechism in Nordic churches. In Norway, also the priesthood calls the people to keep Saturday as Sundays. That's in the theological periodicals for the Lutheran, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Norway. Even the Sabbatarians were found in England, Holland, Bohemia, and of all places, Transylvania, in the Romish areas. In the 15th century, even as late, these Bohemians kept not only the Sabbath day scrupulous, but they were also called Sabbatarians. The church in Norway, the church council held at Bergen in August 22nd, 1439. The first man concerned the keeping holy of Saturday. He had come to earth of the archbishop that people in different places of the kingdom had ventured the keeping holy of Saturday. It is strictly forbidden, it is stated in church law, for anyone to keep or adopt holy days outside of those which the Pope, Archbishop, or Bishop appoints. Trying to change the times. And we read that in Louis VII, King of France, from 1498 to 1515, being informed by the enemies of the Waldenese and having a part of the province that several Hanians' crimes were laid to their account, set the master request that a certain doctor of Sorbonne be make inquiry into this matter. On their return, they reported that they had visited all the parishes, but could not discover any traces of those whose crimes with which they were charged. On the contrary, they kept the Sabbath day, observed the ordinance of baptism according to the primitive church, and instruct their children in the articles of the Christian faith and the commandments of Elohim. The king, having hearing report of his commissioner, said with oath that they were better than himself or his people. And that's also found in the history of the Christian church. India separated from the Western world for 1,000 years. They were naturally ignorant of many of the novelties introduced by the councils and decree of the Laterans. "We are Christians, not idolaters," was the expressive reply when required to do homage to the image of Virgin Mary. And in the 16th century, in the reign of Elizabeth, it occurred to many conscientious and independent thinkers that the 4th commandment required of them the observance, not of the first, but of the specified 7th day of the week. In Russia, the accused Sabbath keepers were summoned, for they had openly acknowledged the new faith and defended the same. The most eminent of them was Secretary of State, Kurtzelin, Ivan Maximov Kasina, archimandrite of the Fury Monastery of Novgorod. They were condemned to death and publicly burned in cages in Moscow on 17 December 1503. And that's written in the Geschichte of the Juden, which is the history of the Jews. In Sweden, the zeal for Saturday keeping continued for a long time. Even little things which might strengthen the practice of keeping Saturday were punished. And in Liechtenstein, and in the states of Austria, Bohemia, Moravia, Hungary, Liechtenstein, and the Rhine Valley wasn't their country until the end of the 2nd century. The Sabbatarians teach that the outward Sabbath, i.e. Saturday, still must be observed. They say that Sunday is the Pope's invention. And that's well said. And that was written in Refutation of the Sabbath by Wolfgang Capito, which was published in 1599. In Bohemia, Dr. R. Cox says, I find from the passage in Erasmus that the early period of Reformation, where he wrote that there were Sabbatarians in Bohemia who not only kept the seventh day, but were said to be scrupulous in resting on it. And Dr. Ersk in Germany, he said that however the church has transferred the observance of Saturday to Sunday by virtue of her own power without scripture. And that's written in Enchiridion, the Princess of Liechtenstein, about the many of the Sabbath keepers found shelter on the state of Lord Leonhard of Liechtenstein, held to the observance of the true Sabbath. In India, the famous Jesuit Francis Xavier called for the Inquisition, which was set up in Goa, India, in 1560 to check the Jewish wickedness, as he called it. Of course, Sabbath keeping. And Sabbath keeping in that time also existed in Abyssinia, Finland, Switzerland, Holland, and Germany. And we get to the 7th-day century. In England, as for the teaching only 5 days a week and resting upon Saturday, she was carried to the new prison in Maiden Lake, a place where they appointed for the restraint of several other people of different opinions from the Church of England. Miss Trask lay 15 or 16 years as a prison for her opinion about the Saturday Sabbath. Here in India are about 9 or 10 churches that keep the Sabbath, besides many of the scattered disciples who eminently preserved it. In Hungary, Transylvania, or Romania, but as they rejected Sunday and rested on the Sabbath, Prince Sigmund Bethany ordered their persecution. Pesce advanced to the position of Chancellor of State and next in line to the throne of Transylvania. He studied his Bible and composed a number of hymns, mostly in honor of the Sabbath. Pesce was arrested and died in 1640. The Sabbath was still kept in Sweden and Finland. The Muscovite Russian Church, they solemnized Saturday, the old Sabbath. India, the Jacobites, they still kept Saturday holy. They have solemn service on Saturday. I'm almost finished. Sabbath observance through the century continued in the 18th century. Abyssinians, the Jacobites, assembled on the Sabbath day before the Dominical day in the temple and kept that day, as do also the Abyssinians, which were seen from confession of their faith by the Ethiopian king Claudius. Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Joseph II's edict of tolerance did not apply to the Sabbatarians, who again lost almost all their possessions. In Germany, Tenhart of Nuremberg, he holds strictly to the doctrine of Sabbath because it's one of the 10 commandments of Leben and Wirken, life and importance. They also observed it in Moravia and America. As a special instance, it deserves to be noticed that he has resolved with the church at Bethlehem to observe the 7th day as a rest day. And there's a small body of German Sabbath keepers in Pennsylvania, and that's in the history of religious denominations in the United States. And in the 19th century, Russia moved to the Crimea. The majority moved to the Crimea and the Caucasus, where they remained true to their doctrine in spite of persecution to this present time. The people called them Sabbatniki, or Sabbatarians. Again, the Geschichte the Jews in Poland, or the histories of Jews in Poland. In China, at this time, Hung prohibited the use of opium and even tobacco and all intoxicating drinks, and the Sabbath was religiously observed. The seventh day is most religiously and strictly observed. The Taiping Sabbath is kept upon our Saturday. China, India, and Persia, Denmark, Sweden, and America, there were people keeping the Sabbath. In America, it was the beginning of the Seventh-day Adventists in 1844. And we come down to the 20th century. American congregations, they say that the current notion that Yeshua and his apostle authoritatively substituted the first day for the Sabbath is absolutely without any authority in the New Testament, and as written by Dr. Lyman Abbott in the Christian Union. The Anglican Episcopal, the Catholics changed it. We have made the change from the seventh day to the first day, from Saturday to Sunday, on the authority of one holy Catholic Apostolic Church of Christ. And that's the Episcopalian Bishop Seymour, why we keep Sunday. Sunday Sabbath is not in the Scriptures, written by one of the Baptists. There was and is a commandment to keep holy the Sabbath day, but the Sabbath day was not on Sunday. It will be said, however, with some show of triumph, that the Sabbath was transferred from the seventh to the first day of the week, with all its duties, privileges, and sanctions. Earnestly desiring information on this subject, which I studied for many years, I asked, where can we find a record of such transaction? Not in the New Testament, absolutely not. There's no scriptural evidence of the change of the Sabbath institution from the seventh to the first day of the week. I wish to say that this Sabbath question, and this aspect of it, is the gravest and most perplexing question concerned with Christian institution, at which present claims attention from the Christian people, and the only reason that is not more disturbing element in Christian thought and religious discussion is because the Christian world has settled down content on the conviction that somehow a transference has taken place at the beginning of Christian history. There's been no change, only by the authority of the Catholic Church. Do we follow the Catholic Church, or do we follow what Yeshua, what Yahweh have told us from the very beginning of time? As we go down, we know the rest of the story. We think now we live in present-day America, that persecution will not come upon Yahweh's people. They say that we have a constitution that won't happen to us. We have a freedom of religion. But what portion of their constitution have they not trampled asunder, or have not usurped through the courts, their compelling interests, and through their legislative bodies? We're still in danger of the persecution, but we stand strong in our belief that the Sabbath is truly the day. It is the day we have sealed in our foreheads. It is the day that's going to save us, and it's the mark that's going to save us in the day of Yahweh. Our redemption is drawing nigh. It's coming soon. And hallelujah when it does.